Now, in preparation for the upcoming summit on the International Conference on Population and Development to be held in Nairobi, Kenya, the South African Department of Social Development hosted a preparatory seminar themed South-South Collaboration for Sustainable Development. The International Conference on Population and Development is in its 25th year and brings together representatives from about 26 countries. Joining us now to talk more about this, we're joined by Jacque van Zuydam, who is the Chief Director for Population Development in the Department of Social Development. A very good evening to you, and thank you very much for speaking to us.
Good evening. Thank you very much for the invitation.
So I'd imagine this 25-year milestone is important because it builds on some of the challenges that you've experienced and also the goals that you were working towards from the original Cairo summit.
Yes, yeah, the milestone is important. I think just one correction, it's not 26 countries, it's all the countries of the world that will be represented.
Okay. But the 26 represent your partnership.
Yeah. We've got plus minus 26 countries with whom we collaborate fairly closely on some aspects of population. The population is so diverse.
Absolutely.
You have friends on certain issues and then they are not your friends anymore on other issues. The South African government itself participated in the Cairo summit, Cairo conference in 1994 as a new democracy and agreed to the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development. So we've obviously actively participated in the global monitoring of progress with the implementation of the program of action, as well as the monitoring of its implementation and progress in the country itself, particularly through the country's population policy, which is part of our sort of overall development planning framework. The United Nations, in convening the summit, has the objective to obviously reconfirm the commitments of as many governments as well as civil society organizations and other sectors to continue the implementation of the program of action, as well as to, through focusing on what are the main issues 25 years later, what is the so-called unfinished business within the context of the Sustainable Development Goals.
What are the main issues now? Because as you said that when we talk about population development, it's such a wide subject, and you spoke about the fact that not all countries are necessarily born equal. Part of the criticisms of the SDGs has been that there's not been enough focus on social aspects of the challenges populations face.
Now, obviously, in the domain of population, one finds almost like a convergence of social challenges. In different parts of the world, one obviously has different challenges, but it's quite clear that nowhere are there no challenges. I think many countries in the Northern Hemisphere are probably more concerned about migration, for example. Countries in the Southern Hemisphere have concerns that basically relate to what emanates from conditions of poverty and inequality. For our government itself, the status of women and gender equality remains a very important agenda item, because in essence, no developmental policy can really work unless men and women are equal partners in such a policy.
And especially when you also look at sexual and reproductive health rights, that's also a major issue if we're talking about development and any progression of a country towards growth.
Now, for our country, particularly, sexual and reproductive health and rights has been a fundamental rights issue since 1994. In South Africa, our constitution and legislation actively promotes the freedom of choice that women have in relation to matters that affect their bodies, and that obviously, therefore, makes every South African entitled to sexual and reproductive health services, which we understand in an expanded manner to also include the right, for example, to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. We also understand it to include the one's rights regardless of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now, those are matters that we advocate actively in the international fora on population matters, and it's a matter that our government, with its partners that hold the same beliefs on sexual and reproductive health and rights, will be articulating and promoting in the Nairobi summit. For us, it's important in the context of the region in which we are, obviously to work together closely with our neighboring countries, but also to advocate what we believe are population type of programs and interventions that would contribute to the region's total development. And of course, I think it's common knowledge that in Africa there's much disagreement on the status of women and therefore on sexual and reproductive health and rights as well. Now, we try to not politicize the matter, but rather to unpack the benefits of doing things the way we are doing in South Africa. So almost
as in the common goals that Africa would have in terms of growth and development.
Africa has obviously the Agenda 2063, which is a sort of broad blueprint for the continent's development. In the area of population, the African countries have actually agreed very strongly on a program to promote the international program of action in the continent that was in the form of a declaration. It was called the Addis Ababa Declaration of 2013. The weakness of the Addis Ababa Declaration is that it has a rider within it, which basically says we are committing to do all these things, but subject to national legislation, etc., etc. You know, so one would find that, you know, certain governments would agree at one level to non-discrimination, but on the other hand continue implementing legislation that either discriminates or undermines certain rights. Or, you know, what is really the harshest from our observations across the continent is often it's not active discrimination, but it's, for example, the withholding of essential sexual and reproductive health services. So a government would say, no, women in our country can freely choose the spacing and number of children they have, but if they go and look for the tools with which to control that spacing and to really exercise it, they don't find it in local clinics and so on.
I'm just wondering, and it's just interesting to look at your partners on population development. So those 26 countries.
Yeah, those are the 26, yeah.
So South Africa must be in a very unique position in the sense that it's hugely different in some respects with the rest of some of these members, but at the same time they have commonalities in certain areas as well. So what line are you pushing when you go to the summit in Kenya?
When we engage internationally on population matters, I mean, first of all, of course, what informs the government's approach, as well as the approach of the non-governmental organizations with whom we collaborate in the international space, is the interests of South Africa's own population. So obviously, when we get into the politics of population, it's always against the backdrop of what would be best for South Africa's people. Then we almost have like a three-prong approach. The one leg of the approach is so-called South-South collaboration, which basically is the alliance of partners in population and development that has members in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. What we gain from that partnership is to be in a space where developing countries discuss with each other the problems of developing countries, and we learn from each other in terms of the innovations that one might find in certain countries or others. The second leg of our international engagement is obviously to work as closely as possible with other African countries, particularly in Southern Africa, but again, without compromising what is important for South Africans. But, you know, stability, including social stability in Africa, is good for everyone in Africa, including us. And then the third leg is to advocate our beliefs, principles, and values, which often puts us in alliances with countries that are elsewhere in the world.
All right, Jacque, I'm afraid we have run out of time, but thank you so much,
thanks very much
for joining us and speaking to us. Jacque van Zuydam is a Chief Director for Population Development in the Department of Social Development in South Africa. We're going to take a quick break. Don't go away.